Welcome to the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had, part 23. As I remind everybody, we are going to be talking about sensitive matters, and it is important to listen to the shmooze from beginning to end. So you start with the one that's labeled intro, and you work your way through. You can see that they're labeled that way, and also if you are accessing this through YouTube, Google my YouTube channel and then look at the playlist. The playlist will be Chosson Shmooze, and then they all feed into each other. Material from this is available also in a PDF, and you can email me for that information. The discussion for today is going to continue in sexual dysfunction, and today we're going to talk about another very common male sexual dysfunction that comes from anxiety as well, mostly. And we discussed in yesterday's discussion the value of this, the halachic value of this, the hashkafic value of this. We cannot repeat ourselves. We also spoke about causes for anxiety, guilt, resentment, many different things. But the point is that anxiety expresses itself differently. And ironically, in one person that could be premature ejaculation, in another person it could be impotence, or even delayed ejaculation. Now, some people might be saying, oh, wow, I wish I had delayed ejaculation. But you should know that it can be extremely frustrating when a person has that kind of dysfunction, because they could try to have an orgasm and go for 20, 30 minutes and still can't ejaculate. And it's not satisfying for the man, and it might be exhausting for the woman. And again, people are sensitive. The woman might feel that somehow or another she's not attractive or loved, and the man might feel somehow he's missing in his potency, either in a delayed ejaculation, which means that the person cannot ejaculate after a certain point that feels like he or she wants that, or impotence, where the person gets aroused or doesn't get aroused very quickly. Now, let's talk about some issues. 99%, that's not an exact number, but it's fairly correct. 99% of sexual dysfunction is psychological, not actually due to any biological cause. That doesn't mean that it doesn't reside in the physiology and the nervous system of the person, just like stomach aches or headaches can be highly physiologically experienced, but the cause still could come from anxiety or distress. And that's not in any way to say something dismissive like it's all in your head. Everything is all in our head. We only live in our heads because that's the only place that we understand and interpret reality. This is completely irrelevant whether or not it's, quote, psychological. What's important to know is so-called medical cures, while they can be helpful and an important adjunct, whether one is considering taking SSRIs like Prozac or Zoloft to reduce anxiety. Also, it can sometimes have an effect on helpfully delaying ejaculation, but it also can have an effect on over causing the ejaculation to be so delayed, again, that it's considered a dysfunction. And all these things, yes, there are physiological pieces to it, no doubt, but 99% still ultimately comes from the major sex organ that lies between your two ears. In other words, your brain and your heart. And we can learn how to manage those anxieties. Now, the first thing to determine, let's say a person has difficulty with either getting an erection, or difficulty sustaining an erection, or difficulty ultimately ejaculating, is very simply said, if it functions sometimes, the chances of there being a physical problem in the plumbing is minimal. Many men wake up with an erection, or while they are asleep have an erection, and that's because the bladder presses up against the prostate gland, and that causes an erection. So if a person can have an erection at times, when you're dealing with a plumbing issue, either it works or it doesn't. Yes, it's true that increased blood flow can help a problem. So, for example, if, let's say, a person is not in the best vascular health, and so there's a reduction of blood flow to that area, it could interfere with arousal and erection, and so something like Viagra could increase the blood flow because it dilates the blood vessels. Now, So if 20% is due to blood flow, so this could help, but 80% is still due to whether or not you're really aroused. If a person has an erection while they're sleeping, or even they're able to ejaculate in other circumstances, whether they're masturbating or it happens while they're sleeping, it means that all the plumbing is working. So we're dealing with largely a psychological issue. And that's why an easy way to diagnose these things is that way. Now, it's not to say, again, that medication can't help. And certainly also, all of this is really educational. I can't give you therapy, and you can't get medication through a video discussion. So that is something people should very much consider. Here I'm educating you because I want you to know what you need to know on the chance that you could help yourself with it. And also, even if you're not able to actually solve the problem, when you go for help, you'll have a sense of who's competent and isn't competent in this area, because much of this has been researched heavily, and these techniques are evidence-based. There's just much trial and error over dozens of years in really what works in terms of sex therapy and what doesn't. Now, I would suggest if someone has a difficulty with either maintaining an erection or with a inability to ultimately ejaculate, I would suggest, like we spoke about a few discussions ago in terms of vaginismus, you need a hard reset. So for 2 weeks, one should consider making a pact with your spouse that you're not going to engage in any kind of intercourse, even any type of more erotic, passionate touching. Just normal hugging, the warmth, the love associations, not even going into sexual arousal. If you get aroused, fine, but do not focus on it, and certainly don't have intercourse. Just to be able to experience the mindful pleasures, and it is very pleasurable to touch. A hormone oxytocin is released after 20-30 seconds of touch that produces a very warm feeling. If you didn't know that sex came after just touch, believe me, you would think it's the greatest thing in the whole world. I mean, even the Gemara says that if somebody looks at the small pinky of a woman in order to be aroused, it's considered a sin. What are they saying? Because they understand that anything can be arousing. They understand that anything can feel incredibly pleasurable. So you should do that for 2 weeks. And again, as I mentioned in the other video, I'm not here to give you halachic psak. If you have difficulty with this and wonder if it's permitted or not, you need to talk to a Rav who's knowledgeable in sexual shalom bayis issues. And I'm not here to give you that. I'm here right now to explain to you what works best. And I explained why I've taken that approach as well in prior videos. So that would be good for 2 weeks. Then for another 2 weeks, allow sexual passion, but also no intercourse. And while you're doing this, do not pay attention to whether or not you have an erection. Don't pay attention to it. Ideally, one should consider doing this whole activity completely in the dark, because this way the person doesn't have to have any anxiety. One should not be checking if they have an erection. One should not notice. The entire mindfulness should be focused on simply the moment of the experience. And again, I mentioned some great mindfulness exercises are to actually go to the bathroom and notice all the very complex associations and physical sensations that come with the process of going to the bathroom. Try eating mindfully. Pick up a sandwich, which, by the way, the kuzari, I forget where. I believe it's somewhere in the fifth book, and I believe it might be around 23, but I don't know. Don't hold me to it. If somebody wants to know where it is, you can send me an email. But the kuzari mentions one reason why we make brachas is for mindfulness, that Hashem wanted us to enjoy the eating. And we won't enjoy the eating if we don't pause and experience gratitude for what we're eating. But the point is, even eating could be much more mindful. You could feel the texture of the food. You can sense the taste. You can smell the odors. You could notice your salivary glands working. Very similarly with sexuality, through mindfulness, you're able to achieve a much greater state of relaxation and control, which will allow for a lot more. So don't even pay attention to whether you have an erection or not. That's not the goal. You're not going to be having intercourse. You're not doing anything. You're simply enjoying touch. And now for this next period of 2 weeks, you're having a more passionate sexual kind of touch. The last stage would be to agree that you're going to have intercourse when you feel like it, but your goal, again, is not to be involved. Do not focus on whether or not you have an erection. Just have the experience. Ideally, like we said, in the dark. Ideally, the woman should be on top so you're not in any anxious state, and the woman should take control of all of those aspects. And her understanding, too, should be the goal here is not ejaculation, it's not erection, it's not intercourse, it's simply an experience. Whatever happens, happens. The less you check, the better, because what destroys arousal is anxiety. So it becomes an awful, vicious circle where a person's going to end up checking to see if they have an erection, or seeing if they're getting aroused enough to ejaculate, and that makes them anxious. The more anxious it makes them, the less aroused they get, and the more problematic it is. You have to break that cycle. You also could consider, if none of these things work, you can consider manual stimulation, which is what we spoke about in the prior video about how to work with premature ejaculation, which would be with lubrication and your wife touching you so that you could learn and feel comfortable. But again, if you do it for an issue having to do with getting impotent, then you would need to not focus at all on whether or not you're aroused, not pay attention to it, and just let her do her thing. Now, there's an issue, obviously, with Motzi Zer Levatala. Again, there may be ways that this is permitted. You need to speak to a Rav. I'm not going to, tell you that this is permitted on a video, and not for everybody is. It has to do with the level of dysfunction and the level of distress and all those things. However, there is potentially a way that such a thing could be permitted if the overall goal is sexual health and functioning in the relationship. So these are many techniques that one could use. I have to say that ultimately these problems are rather complex, and ein chovush matir atzmo mibeis asurim. It is very difficult for a person to extricate themselves from these kinds of anxiety loops, and you should get professional help. And oftentimes, in the hand of a skilled professional, one could solve these problems relatively quickly. These are not necessarily long-term problems, not necessarily. So if you cannot find a way through these things, get help, because life is short, at least on this world, and why not do the best that you can?